This is a book that I wrote and I put out a few weeks ago, and it's essentially a way for all jazz musicians to practice forever. And it's to give you a way forward when you don't know what to practice and when you're unsure of how to delegate your time. Here's how we're going to do it. We start by picking our end time, right? So we figure out how long we're going to practice before we start practicing, and then we divide the time essentially. So here's an example. If it's 11 a.m., I want to be done practicing at 12:30. I give myself a little buffer, and it'll be 75 minutes of practicing. I'll explain all this in a minute, but here I have a melodic minor scale exercise, scales and fourths, and I put the metronome marking, and I would do that for 30 minutes, and then a transcription, 45 minutes, and then a long tone exercise. And I set timers for these. So since we don't have all day to practice, the only way to make consistent progress that we can actually track and measure is to be very efficient with our time. And it's the best use of our time in all things, right? So I divide practice into three categories. The first one is transcription, second one is technique, and then the third one is basically everything else, right? So this can be time, harmony, learning tunes, sight reading, composition, arranging, all those other things besides transcription and technique. And the reason we have those two things is that when we transcribe, we're getting ideas and we're also training our ear, right? So we get the ideas, we get the material, and then we practice technique so that we can execute that material. So those two things go together. So like I said before, we start by picking our time frame and we leave a buffer. And that buffer usually ends up being the time that you are setting up your stuff, right? Like your gear, if you're putting your horn together or if you're getting your music out and getting organized. It's nice to have a buffer so that you can ensure that you're done on time. If you had an hour to practice and you gave yourself an hour of stuff to do, you're going to be done after that hour, right? So you're going to be practicing, you're going to be working longer than you intended to. So I always leave like 15 minutes usually. And I set timers. I put my phone on airplane mode and I'll set timers on either my phone or my iPad, depending on where I am, right? And those timers keep me on track. So I'll start doing something, and then when the timer goes off, even if I'm not done, I cut it there, right? And then I know I'll be back at it tomorrow. So it's a great way to hold yourself accountable and not be distracted because the timer really keeps you focused. And it's nice to be able to stop when the timer's done. If you're practicing without timers in like a more free way, that lends itself nicely to some things, right? Like sometimes learning a tune I find can be better without a timer, so I don't feel like rushed. But sometimes you can practice for a while and you kind of get bored and sick of it and you stop progressing and then you don't want to practice more. So it's a good way to practice sustainably, right? So I take that total amount of time, I divide it, and then I set the timers when I'm practicing. And instead of warming up at the beginning, I warm up at the end. And this is something that everyone should do. And the reason is that when you're in a real musical situation, a real playing situation, you don't have time to go through a long warm up before you play. If you show up to a gig, you're just going to get your horn out and you're going to start playing. If you're at a rehearsal, you're not going to do a long warm up before. You have to be ready to play. So we can train ourselves to always be ready to play at any given moment. And the way that we do this is by just not warming up when we practice. So if I'm going to practice, usually I'll just go straight into a transcription and I'll just play like that. Or if it's sight reading or something, I'll just take the horn out, put it together, and just start playing without doing any kind of long tones before. And I've done that for long enough that I feel ready to play all the time, basically. I don't feel like I need to warm up. And it's a very liberating feeling to not kind of be like a slave to the horn. Like you have to be warmed up to play. So that stuff that you would do as a warm-up, normally for most people it's fundamentals, so like long tones or some like scale thing or like a flow study, that kind of stuff you can place at the end of your practice session, and it's kind of like a nice way to warm down. So normally I end with long tones, and I'll do that kind of after the timers are done. So after I go through what I have divided up the material that I have divided up, I will go do my long tones, and that's the last thing I do. So for technique, there are three main areas that we practice, like three main things that we practice. We practice scales and arpeggios, which is the most fundamental element of music, essentially. Scale patterns, where we take those scales and arpeggios and we rearrange them, because in jazz, scales are more like a collective sound rather than just going up and down the scale, which is more what it is in classical music and other genres of music. Then we have abstract shapes, which is a really advanced jazz concept. But the thing to note here is that we're always going to be practicing all three of these things. Like, it's not like you master one, then you master two, and then you go to three. You kind of cycle through all of them at all times. And they're all very important fundamental things that we have to have down in our playing. So these three things that make up our technical practice, we do this stuff all in two different scales, the major scale and the melodic minor scale. Those two scales can get you through virtually all chord qualities. So you can be playing and improvising over jazz standards using only these two scales, and it really simplifies things when you're trying to learn what to play, right? And then, so those two scales, and then we have three types of arpeggios that we also need to practice: major 7, minor 7, and dominant 7. These are the most common types of chord qualities. So when we practice these arpeggios, if we practice these in all 12 keys and in different intervals, we can recognize chords right away. And then when we practice the scales and stuff, we'll have stuff to play over them. And knowing how to apply that stuff is just theoretical practice. So that would fall into like the other category. When we're transcribing, it's great to transcribe with intention, right? We have to know why we're transcribing the solo and what we want to get out of it before we go to transcribe it, or else we're kind of just wasting our time. So think about what you seek to gain and which kind of aspect you're studying. If you're studying their tone, their time, their swing feel, their use of like cliches or humor, right? So the first step, listen to the solo a ton, right? You can save a lot of time in the practice room by listening to the solo before you go to transcribe it, because then you already know how it sounds, right? You don't have to basically learn it from scratch. You get some of that work done before, outside of the practice room. Then you learn all the notes and stuff. And then the part that a lot of people skip is really digging into the inflection and all of the little things besides just the notes and rhythms, and trying to emulate the player the best they can. This is where we get a lot of flexibility in our sound. And what's interesting here is that a lot of people don't want to emulate other players because they don't want to be unoriginal, right? Like, we want to have our own sound. We don't want to just sound like some other player. But what actually happens is when you're transcribing all these different players, you take aspects of each of them, and when we're transcribing, we're practicing the ability to change our sound to fit in a different context. We end up with a much more original and flexible sound that we can adapt to our surroundings. And this comes from emulating other players. And then lastly, I would write down the solo. So if you want to write down the solo, if you want to keep a record of what you're transcribing, I would do that at the end. And the reason is that people who transcribe people who write the solo down while they're transcribing it and figuring it out, sometimes they take shortcuts and they'll play what's easiest to write rather than what the player is actually playing. So if you play along without necessarily thinking of how it would be notated, you can get a product that's much more accurate to what the musician originally intended. Learning tunes. So this is what I do at least once a week, right? I'll start by listening to a bunch of different recordings and basically researching the tune, especially with vocalists. And then learning the lyrics is a great way to interpret the melody while you're playing it as an instrumentalist who's not singing, right? Then what I like to do is I like to kind of noodle over the tune and figure out how the harmony is functioning. From there, I'll learn the melody, which is supremely important when we're learning standards. Then I will make sure that the chord changes are right. And when you're doing this, it can help to listen to the bass note and then figure out if it's major or minor, figure out the seventh, and then you can kind of deduce what it is from there, right? So the bass note is really useful. And then I practice the tune in all 12 keys. So I'll take it through, and that really helps to internalize it. Learning it by ear is really important when we're trying to remember tunes, because if you just read a lead sheet of a tune, you're never going to remember it. But if you learn it by ear, you're going to remember it a lot better, because it takes work and it takes effort to transcribe the tune. So you can learn a lot more about all this stuff by checking out the book. There's a lot of more details in there, how to practice this stuff, a lot of specific information. So I hope you check it out, and I hope this was useful.